The paradox of North Korea, a nation that has shocked and unsettled the world. How could a country where for decades the average salary barely touched $4 a month, where only 1% of the people had a car, although roads are mostly unpaved anyway, and where only elites like Olympic champions and high-ranking military officers had refrigerators, managed to create one of the most expensive and sophisticated technologies known to humanity: nuclear weapons. To be honest, for a long time, I thought that any country could easily create its own nuclear weapons. Just choose a missile as intimidating as possible, stick something radioactive and glowing green inside, slap on a sticker, and boom, you're ready to bully your neighbors. In reality, deciding to build nuclear weapons is an enormous commitment. You need the smartest engineers and a handful of scientists who truly understand nuclear reactions. You need special materials like plutonium that is extremely hard to get. And you need billions of dollars to build an industrial base. North Korea had almost none of this. Even superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union, with seemingly endless resources, struggled to make their first bombs. And this is what North Korea looked like when they set out to build one. Here's the question. The country has just suffered a brutal war. Cities, factories, the entire infrastructure is destroyed. People are starving. So why does Kim Il-sung decide to pursue the bomb? Why sacrifice everything and set the course for several generations? Hardly a prosperous fate. There are a few reasons for that. First, during World War II, when Japan refuses to surrender, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happen. So it's plausible that Kim Il-sung, North Korea's future founder, is shocked by what he sees and gets obsessed with an idea that only nuclear weapons can guarantee protection and sovereignty to a country. Second, after World War II, in 1948, the Korean Peninsula splits into a pro-American South and a pro-communist North. Both sides see the other as temporary occupiers. So in 1950s, North Korea attacks to liberate the South. The US responds with the so-called nuclear diplomacy. If you do not stop, we nuke you. The war ends without bombs dropping, but Kim's left with this nasty feeling. The US just humiliated him by waving a weapon that could scorch his country into a radioactive wasteland if he doesn't behave. And throughout the years, he could see what happens to leaders of other countries if they do not behave well. They fall with the help of the West. Whether those leaders were good or bad isn't the point. It's that these cases hit the supreme leader hard. It could happen to North Korea just as easily. And again, nukes are the only sure way to protect the country and the regime. But besides defense, Kim's eyeing nukes for offense too, because he's still got sincere ambitions for the great, unified Korea, and to pull that off, they might wield them for pressure or actually using it. All those reasons make sense. It explains why Kim is so fixated on nuclear weapons. We got it. It's late 50s. Now, where does he start? What does he need? Nuclear specialists, extremely rare, hardly any even in the world, let alone one country. So Kim sends students to study nuclear physics to, of course, dear comrade USSR. By now, Soviets are very advanced in this field. More than that, they offer Kim a deal. Sign nuclear cooperation accords and will supply a reactor. Peaceful use only. Moscow fears proliferation, yet it also wants its ally to develop a civilian nuclear industry and not fall behind. Of course, Kim signs, and by 1965, the USSR builds North Korea's first small research reactor, the IRT-2000. What's interesting, while the Soviets constructed, Korean engineers stay sharp, taking notes and learning every detail. Okay, now they have the reactor. What can they do with it? Well, while it's working and uranium fuel rods are inside, they can use it for power generation, research, even creating medical isotopes for cancer treatment. Is Kim excited about all that? Not much. But the dark side begins when you stop the reactor, remove those fuel rods and reprocess them, because you can get plutonium, the key ingredient, the filling for a nuclear bomb. That's what really grabs the supreme leader. He never stops thinking about deterrence and Korean unification. But after Stalin's death, North Korea gets concerned, because under his lead, USSR was all tough, expansionist, and focused on military might in the Cold War. And the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, unveiled the unthinkable: peaceful coexistence with the West. Sounds positive, right? Finally, the end of the Cold War. So why North Korea is concerned? Here's the thing, Kim's pact with the USSR likely guarantees help if he's attacked. But what if he attacks first to liberate American-held South Korea? The problem is that North Korean forces are advised, trained, and fully supplied by USSR. So with the new peaceful coexistence shift, Soviets might not just refuse to join the fight, they can completely cut supplies to avoid damaging relations with the US. That's why Kim ramps up an independent military-industrial base and nuclear program, not just for defense, but for offense too, when the moment to unify ripens. China sees the peaceful policy as a betrayal. Mao is sure Moscow is giving up the revolution to the capitalists. North Korea can't say that out loud, but they make it pretty clear they feel the same. And in 1962, this stance backfires. Just weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world is one breath away from nuclear war, North Korean delegation flies to Moscow. They ask for weapons, but instead of the usual free support, they get a cold reply. We are not giving it away. If you want it, you buy it. That's Moscow's way of saying, we're not happy you're leading too close to China. It doesn't end the alliance. They still need each other, but it's the turning point that reshapes everything. That's when Kim Il-sung doubles down on Juche, total self-reliance. Their own factories, their own ideology, their own army, and the key ingredient, their own nukes. The only guarantee, no refusals, no commands. So the development gets a lot busier. In just 9 years after the launch, they even managed to upgrade the Soviet-built IRT-2000, doubling its power. But the strains with the USSR aren't the only spark for North Korea's nuclear push. There's another. In 1971, during the Nixon-era retrenchment, he withdraws 20,000 US troops from South Korea, a move that looks like the start of a trend. Seoul realizes that without American forces in the country, the threat of an attack rises sharply. What's the solution? Nuclear weapons. It's a mirror image. Now South Korea launches its own nuclear program, but they're hiding it from their big brother, the United States. North Korean intelligence find out about it quickly, and they accelerate the program even harder. No way they'll let the South to build a bomb first. But how could the South even catch up? North Korea has been at it for 15 years. Yet, limited resources and secrecy have kept progress sluggish. The program nowhere near done. South though, even as newcomers by the 70s, they have booming economy and major manufacturers in heavy industry and tech. So North Korea's worries make sense. They speed up, fearing the South might surge ahead. Within a few years though, the US uncovers the nuclear program and forces Seoul to shut it down, while North Korea, fueled by that fear, accelerated and shows no signs of stopping. Ironically, the secret program meant to buy safety ends up a shot in the foot. A few years later, North Korea starts building a new 5 megawatts reactor based on the British Magnux design. Wait, shouldn't it be a super secret thing? Where'd they get it? From open technical literature the British released and even touted for prestige and export appeal. No full blueprints, just pictures, diagrams, and performance specs. But by the early 80s, that's more than enough for North Korean engineers, because they trained and got experience on the small Soviet RT-2000 research reactor. Building the 5 megawatts Magnux-type reactor is a major step for Pyongyang, but Kim has dreamed for decades of something much bigger, a nuclear power plant. Would it flood him with plutonium? Not really. In standard electricity generating mode, it doesn't produce much of it, and they will have the Magnux-type reactor to cover plutonium producing anyway. So why then Kim wants it so eagerly? Electricity? Sure, but the real draw, a full industrial ecosystem. Thousands of specialists, supply chains, heavy equipment, a nationwide hub for nuclear skills, and someday, if needs shift from city power to military output, that setup could scale up plutonium production big time. Moscow understands both the stakes and the cost. A power plant is hugely expensive, and North Korea is unlikely to pay. For years, the Soviet leadership dodges a direct yes, without openly snubbing an ally. Therefore, they find a compromise. You want a power plant? Join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And Kim happily does. So in 1985, Moscow finally agrees in principle to supply one. The next year, another score. North Korea brings the Magnox-style reactor online. Officially experimental, but really geared for weapons plutonium. Things seem to be going great for North Korea. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Almost overnight, Pyongyang loses its main provider. No more subsidies, loans, fuel, food, and military supplies, and of course, no promised power plant. Now everything has to be bought, not from a generous USSR, but from a cash-strapped Russia that wants hard currency and market prices. What also hurts is that in capitalistic era, Moscow and Beijing no longer see South Korea as just Washington's puppet. They see a valuable trading partner with a wealthy market and advanced technology. In North Korea, no attractive economy, no political upside, just problems, risks, and demands. It turns out the USSR was so vital to North Korea that once it disappears, the economy plunges into an energy crisis, and the industrial economy begins to unravel. Fuel shipments stall, factories, workshops, and power stations fall idle one by one. The energy crisis set off a domino effect that rippled through every sector. In agriculture, fertilizer and pesticides, once sourced from Soviet bloc, run short. Tractors and irrigation pumps halt without diesel, so yields plummet, and even harvested crops spoil, lacking fuel for transport. The social sector crumbles too. Hospitals and schools lose steady electricity. Families cut down trees to heat their homes. And that's when the strange things start happening. Suddenly, there's a flood of leaks claiming North Korea has either already built a nuclear weapon or is just inches away. Leaks? Why right now? Is Western intelligence suddenly doing a better job? Maybe some other country is snitching? Nope, it turns out it's Pyongyang itself. And the way they do it is almost comically deliberate, losing blueprints in just the right places, starting construction on military facilities where Western satellites can't miss them, even accidentally hinting on state TV that the bomb is nearly ready. That spooks both the US and the Soviet Union. They demand inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and after a long resistance, Kim lets in, and something disturbing comes to light. The data North Korea submitted and what the tests actually show do not match, meaning much more plutonium could be produced than declared. They also found two suspicious waste sites that could hold answers, but Kim doesn't let them in. The inspectors complain, and the case goes up to the United Nations Security Council. Now Pyongyang is cornered. The economy is falling apart. They crave aid, not sanctions. And to get that, they have to show inspectors they did not make plutonium. But the problem is, they did produce it. They cannot surrender their plutonium reserves. The bomb is still regime's life insurance. But if they block inspectors, sanctions could follow, or even use of force. There's no perfect move, so Kim takes a risky one. They shut down the reactor and pull 8,000 fuel rods without the agency's oversight. It's framed routine refueling, but they know it lacks verification. What does it buy them? It erases the trail. Once the core is unloaded off procedure, later, you can't cleanly prove how much plutonium was produced. Well, what's the result? Escalation comes. The US moves supercarrier Kitty Hawk in the Western Pacific, deploys Patriot batteries in South Korea, puts about 37,000 US troops on heightened alert. Pyongyang is not happy about all this fuzz and the gas on its borders. At inter-Korean talks in the demilitarized zone, South Korea warns the United Nations might move to sanctions. The North Korean chief delegate snaps. Seoul is not far from here. If a war breaks out, Seoul will turn into a sea of fire. The world thinks the peninsula could tip into a war, maybe a nuclear one, so everyone tries to cool Pyongyang down. The US even sends former President Jimmy Carter, one of the few outsiders the North likes. After long talks, the agreed framework is signed in 1994. By the way, without Kim Il-sung, who died 3 months earlier during the negotiations. Therefore, it's approved by his successor, son Kim Jong-il. But don't think it's a typical kid becomes king movie. Kim Jong-il's already 52 and long the regime's ruler. So from now on, when I say Kim, I mean Kim Jong-il, North Korea's second supreme leader. Under the deal, North Korea freezes Magnox-style reactor and lets the inspectors back in. The freshly removed fuel rods are canned and monitored, with hopes for a later full analysis of past plutonium. In return, the US and partners create Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, set up specifically to build a light water power plant. While that is built, Washington will supply 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil annually to keep power and heat running. To be fair, the annual fuel is free, unlike the power plant, which is basically a no-interest 20-year loan. Still a great deal. And guess who pays the upfront construction costs? Ironically, South Korea covers most of that. The same country Kim had threatened to turn into a sea of fire months earlier. Yes, the terms are favorable, no doubt, but North Korea is baffling. What about regime security through nuclear weapons? And what about unification, liberating the South from American capitalist puppeteers? Why does the North suddenly agrees to freeze a program pursued for decades? No less surprising are the US and its partners. Why offer such generous terms? Is it pure altruism? No. There are two reasons for that. First, uncertainty. Nobody knows if the North already has a bomb, and no one wants a miscalculation. Even without a legit missile delivery system, in desperation they could try crude delivery. Say, load nukes on small ships, slip it towards South Korea's shores, and detonate. Second, confidence. Confidence that North Korea won't last long. If the regime falls, those contracts won't have to be fulfilled. And that assumption isn't baseless. By the third year without Soviet aid and subsidies, North Korea's economy is in steep decline, so it becomes clear now why Pyongyang accepts the agreement. There's hardly a choice. Across the country, it's not just the lights going out. People have less and less food. And have you noticed how Koreans' attitude toward the nuclear program has evolved? If at first it was all about defense, sovereignty, and unification, then from the early 90s the program adds a less honorable mission, creating leverage to bargain with the West for resources. Yet, despite the good deal, 90s become the worst period of North Korean history besides war. Back-to-back floods in mid-90s and crippling drought in 1997 devastate North Korea's already fragile system and spark a nationwide famine. But the world responds with large-scale humanitarian aid, and by 1998, the mess die-off begins to ease. So after all that, it looks like relations are softening. Pyongyang hosts an inter-Korean summit, smiling leaders meet, and families separated for 50 years reunite. But the core problems don't budge. America doesn't trust Kim, and Kim doesn't trust America. You don't fix 50 years in one handshake. Therefore, by 2002, the DPRK, still poor country, regains some strength, and the second nuclear crisis begins. How so? If the agreed framework still exists. Yeah, right. Producing plutonium isn't allowed. But there can be two options for the core of nuclear bomb. Either plutonium-239 or highly enriched uranium-235. And the deal doesn't spell out uranium enrichment. So Kim tries the early 90s playbook. Start a program, raise fears, force talks, trade a freeze for resources and security guarantees. Maybe that pressures Kato to deliver what they promised almost 10 years ago. Because power plant's supposed to be online already next year, yet on the ground construction barely crawls past foundation. The United States also repeatedly delay fuel oil deliveries. Pyongyang feels cheated. We mostly keep our promises. They drag on theirs. So very soon, United States find evidence that North Korea hides secret cascades of centrifuges to produce highly enriched uranium. What's interesting, Koreans do not deny it outright. Of course, a scandal erupts. One that, hypothetically, could be avoided and solved again with some new agreement. But this is America just after 9/11, now much less accommodating with its enemies. And most importantly, power in Washington has changed. By this time, neoconservatives, led by George Bush, replace Bill Clinton and the Democrats. America suspends oil deliveries and pushes to shut down the construction of the power plant as well. Meanwhile, South Korea and Japan play the good cop. They don't burn bridges and try hard to keep relations alive, and it's understandable. The US chooses A hard line slams the door, but who will pay for the fallout? Where will the nukes fly first? To the nearest neighbors, of course. And what's North Korea's reaction? Well, in 2003, they walk out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, kick out the inspectors, cut the seals, and bring back to life the magnet-style reactor, nearly a decade after the freeze. And remember those 8,000 fuel rods scanned in 1994? They unseal and reprocess them for plutonium. And already 4 years later, in 2006, the arc picks. The culmination of an idea that originated in the North Korea's founder mind half a century ago. They assemble their first nuclear bomb and conduct a test. Yes, it doesn't go smoothly, but the fact matters. The bomb explodes, and from this moment, a new nuclear state appears in the world. North Korea will conduct 5 more tests in the next 10 years, upgrading a bomb and its delivery technology each round. Even when the third Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un arrives in 2011, educated in Switzerland, a fan of the American basketball team Chicago Bulls, nothing changes. Now it becomes clear how such a poor country, after a devastating war, eventually could build nuclear weapons. North Korea is a unique system. Although it is socialist, the power of the people, and so on, in fact, since its founding, it has been ruled by the Kim dynasty. Therefore, in a system where society can choose or object, the state can channel resources for decades wherever it decides. So when the program demanded stripping other sectors of the country and leave people hungry, each ruler did it without hesitation. And if in most countries, a new leader can come every 4 years, very often criticizing his predecessor, changing priorities and direction of a country, in North Korea, everything is the opposite. Because ideology, ambitions, and even behavior pass so smoothly from Kim to Kim that it feels like for more than 70 years, the country has been ruled by one person.